Welcome back. So you remember that promise I made about maybe getting some main quest progress going? Yeah, no, that is not gonna be happening. But that sacrifice is for a good cause, because in a shocking twist, I finally read my comments. Well, to be clear, this isn't unusual. I do read your recommendations, and many of them are good. I am just terminally allergic to casual social interaction, and usually my video backlog is so large that the solutions you share are for problems I no longer have by the time I read them. So... Anyway, I have been intentionally burning down my New Horizons backlog to get RL craft going, and the end of this burndown happened at just the right time to implement a couple of critical recommendations people have made regarding the, thermobaric CPU fryer I have installed in my base. For starters, mana enchanting is not the only system capable of applying over-leveled enchanted books. The ironically named No Knowledge mentioned that there is a ritual implemented in the poorly documented Blood Arsenal add-on that does pretty much the same thing. I tested it, and it works, though it does sadly respect item restrictions when it comes to enchanting, so no fortunate hose for me. This ritual is faster than mana enchanting and is far less laggy, but it does run into a capacity problem fairly early on that means enchantments over level like 40-ish start requiring more juice than my current altar can store. While I could bump that capacity up some, it would not be anywhere near enough to get to the looting 160 requirement, since the enchantment scaling is, like Botania, dominated by a quadratic scaling factor dependent on the level of the enchantment. Still, credit where credit is due, this is a much stronger late game option since it will be far less laggy to scale, and altar capacity is not going to be an issue forever. Another fun option I never considered is a recommendation made by the Shadow of X to use an extra utilities diamond spike. I sort of wrote these things off when thinking about how I could use uber enchanting because they can't be placed on a mana enchanter or disenchanted directly, but Shadow points out that placing and breaking the spike is another way of scrubbing the over enchantment tag off the block, and it allows you to over enchant the thing again as normal. Using one of these would lose me the reusability and versatility of the mana enchanter approach, but in this particular instance that doesn't matter because I only care about the looting level to kill one mob. While sadly lacking in its ability to produce cool chests of useless enchanted books with dummy thick numbers, spike enchanting goes significantly faster, and I'm able to speed the whole thing up further with an XP obelisk to retrieve levels from, rather than manually extracting every single one of them, which is what I was doing beforehand. Instead of my looting uber enchant requiring me to conduct 4 back-to-back binge marathons of the complete Lord of the Rings Extended Edition Director's Cut, it's finished up in about 20 minutes. Congratulations, Shadow, you may have very well saved me from something like 6 to 8 hours of hellish micromanagement, or alternatively, way too many trips to Isengard. And now, for the moment of truth. Yep, that's a book alright. That was anticlimactic. With that last seal on my research limitation lifted, it is time for me to finish out my Thomnomicon. Which means it's time for me to make a bunch more soap, because even though I remembered that the flux scrubber focus was a thing after I blew the first 1800 soap on the problem, I still need a way to dump permanent warp. Yippee. It isn't all that bad, though. While my research machine spins up in the background, let's have some fun with looting 180. So it turns out that looting 180 is just kind of obscene. Because of coding nonsense I'm not going to bother getting into, the amount of extra drops is really variable, but even the average of that variability is still ridiculous. One witch gave me 146 sugar. A pig gave me almost 3 stacks of pork chops. Anything with a trophy is basically guaranteed to drop a trophy, and those are supposed to be, like, rare. I got almost 3.5 stacks of glowstone from a second witch, and the same in sticks from a third. I don't even need to play the does it stack game here because I already know the answer. Yes, it stacks. This hole does not stop getting deeper until you hit the integer limit for the data structure that stores how high an enchantment level can be. And if memory serves, that only comes into play once you start pushing 2 to the 15th power, or roughly 32,700 levels of looting. And you know the worst part? I've been handed the keys to making what may very well be one of the most powerful mob farms in the history of Minecraft, and the only useful thing I can think of to do with this tech is make more charcoal. Not even like more charcoal, just make it more efficiently. So do what I'm already doing, but with less lag. Mob drops just don't matter anymore. I use like maybe a few thousand every once in a while for some Essentia, but my existing mob farms already supply me far in excess of what I will ever need. To try and salvage what little remains of my frame rate, I drained the additional mana batteries by making a bunch of terrasteel and, destroying them. This is Gregtech, so I'm almost certain I'm gonna need to crank out a few stacks of terrasteel or something down the line, but I don't need 576 mana pools to do that, and I certainly don't need to store 576 pools of mana for no good reason. Oh wait, no, sorry, I misspoke. I don't drain the batteries by making terrasteel. I first wire up some dispensers to automatically create terrasteel because terrasteel crafts so fast that I am bottlenecking on my ability to throw items onto the pad. Silly Vazgi, you forgot to add the bulk terrasteel recipe. So yeah, after I get done with my 3+ stacks of useless green metal, and who even cares how much other random stuff, I then take down the extra managed storage banks, because I guess I just don't need to ever do Botania again, or something. I don't know. I also take out the rest of the auxiliary farms. The sprinklers are kind of just a little bit turbo-miserable to live with, even with particles turned all the way down, and I don't really think I'm going to need several million stuffed eggplant for the at least close to medium-range future. So, no thanks. While I'm on the topic, all of the old Gormorillus mana production systems can go as well. They aren't lagging, they're just kind of extra visual clutter, so I may as well take them apart and steal their item conduits or stuff. I don't know. I like Botania and all, but I somehow doubt that I'm going to need to worry about mana production for a little bit ever, and automated rune crafting takes like 5 minutes to set up, so there's really no point keeping this around. Anyway, with that little side project finished up, I now have access to a couple of new toys that I very much want to play with, but they aren't particularly relevant just yet, so I will set them aside in favor of actually making some questline progress. This particular brand of progress involves modernizing my ore production systems. The ore drilling plant is a multi-block that consumes power, and mining fluid, which is basically just water with lube and stone dust mixed in, to manually mine ore blocks in a quite generous area around it. If that were all it did, this would be completely unremarkable, since my pickaxe is also an item that happens to consume durability and concentrated spite to do basically the same thing, and both of those are considerably cheaper. No, what makes the ore drilling plant unique is that not only does it pre-macerate the ore for me, it also produces 3 times as much macerated ore as a traditional ore miner and maceration stack would do, and effectively triples the output of the process. While I could, for now, just summon 3 times as many meteors and process them that way, this multi-block also marks a shift in strategy for how I'm going to be approaching problems. For the lower tiers of the game, you basically just got to enjoy watching me take the phrase, "just do it yourself," to the level of mutually assured destruction, and that was a reasonable option for most problems, and oftentimes was the only one, except for a relatively small handful of very specialized super high throughput things that I needed a lot of. This is no longer going to be the case. Just do more of it more harder works great when you only need a stack of a single kind of wingding, but that strategy starts falling apart when you need several hundred or several thousand stacks of several thousand different kinds of wingdings, which is going to become my reality here in very short order. Add on to that the increasing complexity of multi-block machines, and you very quickly will end up with a situation where human attention span is the single most valuable resource that you can expend on anything, and even very expensive automation that normally would never be worth implementing anywhere else becomes valuable just because it saves you 5 seconds of sanity. The ore drill itself is trivial to set up, though I do admit I spent quite a lot more time fighting with long-distance item and fluid pipelines, only to realize that I just failed to connect both of them at least once in their install phase. Whatever. Crippling lack of object permanence is the spice of life, and all. Oh, and I transform up the power I sent to him to IV and then back down to EV to try and cut down on some of the really extra amount of cable resistance that this thing is experiencing. To give this thing a chance to show off, let's bring down another meteor. I needed tungstate anyway, after all. Once the meteor is down, I can then just push a button on the mining drill and let it roll. It will slowly deploy a mining pipe underneath it, checking the surrounding area for ore blocks in a 48 block radius around the head of the drill, and if it detects any, we'll start chewing away at them, much like the single block version. Unlike the single block version, this one can be told to not fill in broken blocks with cobblestone, allowing me to keep a clean ritual space for future rock summoning. For now, all this ore ends up in a random chest that I put near-ish to my ME system, but I do need to do some more work on that before I'm ready to import materials. I am going to be mining probably several hundred different kinds of ore with this setup, and all of them are going to need to be processed in a way entirely unique to that ore in particular, in order to extract the correct set of secondary and tertiary byproducts that I want from it. I used to do this by hand, by reprogramming what items got exported to what stages of the multi-block process, but that is not a scalable solution. Thankfully, Applied Energistics comes to my rescue again, by saying, just abuse storage buses, you imbecile. These blocks are designed to treat any connected inventory as part of the network, and they can be programmed to accept a huge assortment of items at a higher priority than my racks of storage cells, which basically just lets me tell the system to steal the mining rig outputs before they can be stuck in a system and forgotten about. They also happen to not give a single darn about what happens to those items after they are stored in, say, the input hatch for a macerator. My ore miner is many things, but fast is not one of them. I can almost certainly process ore faster than I can mine it, and if that's not the case, I can just slow down the drill by feeding it less lube, so by smashing a bunch of storage buses onto my multiblocks, I should be able to program them with an ore processing configuration once, turn the system loose, and forget about it. Mining drill products that need auto-processing will be snagged by a higher priority storage bus, and things that don't will just be imported directly and placed next to the Ark of the Covenant in my giant warehouse of things that I will never touch ever again. As long as my ME system doesn't go down due to a power failure, which has happened multiple times, thank you EBF, this should work just fine. Let's take rock salt as an example, because I have way too much of it. Crushed rock salt has only a few secondary outputs that it can produce. I do not care about regular salt because I already have plenty of that, and I also don't have a thermal centrifuge multi-block yet, but I do want borax, so I will want to tell the system that it should dump crushed rock salt ore into my ore washing plant to turn it into clean rock salt ore and regular salt. We're not done though. Clean rock salt ore is still useless, so I can either sift it for crystals of salt for no good reason, or macerate it into purified piles of rock salt, getting some borax in the process. Still not done, I have to then also tell my system to centrifuge the clean rock salt dust into regular rock salt and yet more borax, and this, for now, is the final processing step. Because I have a backlog of ore to process, my machines are probably going to bog down for a bit. When this happens, any leftovers unfortunately just get dumped into the ME system for me to sort out later. For now though, I'm just going to start teaching the system how to process ore and deal with the mess that comes after. I'm already storing an enormous pile of useless junk left over from the old meteors that needs to be processed, so there's really no reason to be getting neurotic about my storage hygiene right now. With that running along happily in the background, let's automate something that actually produces energy for once. Nuclear reactors have another use beyond energy production. The neutron flux from hot reactor rods decaying in them can be used to craft a bunch of things, one of which is cerium. By exposing glowstone rods to a bunch of neutrons from decaying thorium, the rods can be converted to their cerium counterparts and processed. This is not a terribly energy-efficient system in terms of energy production, since by design you want to minimize heat and maximize neutron flux, but it does produce some power, and with my ME system consuming almost 2 EV amps just by existing, some extra power will not go amiss. Speaking of extra power, I need it. My systems already have suffered a couple of inconvenient, though thankfully non-damaging, blackouts, and as I push into IV, I'm going to need more. I am so far away from fully utilizing the energy production capacity of my mob farm that it is hilarious. But for now, that route would require me to spam out yet more fluid extractors and gas turbines, which I'm not terribly interested in. The pollution is bad enough as it is. Add to the fact that my multi-block fluid extractors are a fairly pricey IV technology right now, and you have a big old bundle of no thank you from me for that plan. Happily enough, I have a solution, and that solution is just to make my spicy middle box more spicy. My existing nuclear reactor design is what is referred to as passively cooled, which is a fancy nerd way of saying that no matter how long it runs, it's never going to blow up. Despite being the safest and easiest to automate, these designs are actually kind of terrible in terms of energy output and fuel consumption, since the amount of power a fuel rod produces scales based on how often it interacts with other fuel rods, which produces more heat, and passive cooling sucks at getting rid of heat. This isn't the only kind of nuclear reactor you can make, though. I could make one that produces steam instead of electricity, which would instantly be twice as efficient because of how the mod works, but that involves coolant and making multi-block high-power steam turbines and needing energy output hatches for them, and basically it just turns this whole exercise into the same thing I'm trying to avoid by not using gas turbines, so no, not doing that. Instead, I'm going to apply the Grug Make Magic Box Hotter solution and just cram more uranium in the thing with a little bit of coolant cells to keep the box from melting. Because that seems like a good idea. This is an absolutely terrible idea, so naturally there are multiple wiki pages explaining exactly how you can do it in great and gory detail. The official name for this kind of reactor is a vacuum nuke, since it requires you to use a vacuum freezer to recycle all of the extremely spicy coolant that is running through your nuclear reactor. This name is also conveniently an excellent synopsis of what happens when you mess the automation up. Namely, that it will nuke your base and it will suck. The underlying principle here is that when a fuel rod is touching a coolant cell in a reactor, the rod will preferentially dump its heat output into the coolant instead of overheating the reactor chamber that keeps the thing from blowing up. Once your coolant cell gets too hot, you can then turn off the reactor, stick the cell in a freezer, reinsert the cold cell back into the reactor, and restart the whole process. Sounds easy enough. The only problem is that it's not, and the official guides for implementing one of these things are absolutely unhinged. My brother, you are trusting the people who thought phantoms were a good thing to add to Minecraft to be able to design circuitry to control the coolant systems for a nuclear reactor. And also read. It is also way too many words, so let's just throw all that out and redesign the whole process. A reactor needs a constant supply of coolant to keep from doing the big kablooey. The official guides mention that changing out coolant cells while the reactor is running can result in uncaught heat melting your reactor down into slag, and says that you should do automation to prevent this from happening. Those cowards. It turns out this is true if and only if you simp having the highest possible energy output from your reactors and sacrifice all passive cooling on the altar of the 2% increase in energy output you get for your sins. The largest coolant cells I can make should last several minutes, so as long as I stagger their switching times, literally a single cooling vent makes this a non-issue. If that little bit of power somehow makes a difference, I can just make another nuclear reactor. You are allowed and encouraged to have more than one. This runs into problems with fuel rod replacement though, since those all need to be replaced every 20,000 seconds. This is incredibly annoying to explain, so I won't, and I will instead show you a pretty picture where the green lines mean something is on and the red line means something is off. Wow, that clears up everything. Moving on. The actual assembly involved in this process is quite simple. Put a vacuum freezer in a box. Put a nuclear reactor also in the box. Spend 5 minutes trying and failing to find an organized cable arrangement before just accepting that no such cable arrangement exists and move on. Item conduits can only have their extraction side controlled with redstone in this version, but if you're careful with how you place the vac nuke setup, this does not matter. Since we really do not want the vacuum freezer failing, I also made sure to slap a battery buffer on the thing and fill it up. Freezing coolant does not take a lot of power, somehow. But if somehow the reactor failed, I don't want a blackout to affect it, only for me to restore power and engage in some impromptu terraforming. Next, I forget everything I know about Project Red integration and just spend a solid 30 minutes trying and failing to do basic toggling timer things and vomiting redstone on the skip. Right, so there we go. Basic idea is we have 2 timers and a counter, all of them sped up for testing purposes, so don't get your knickers in a knot. The right timer sends a signal every minute to the counter in the middle that counts up to 334, which is enough time to burn through an entire uranium fuel rod plus a little bit extra buffer to let the reactor cool down. Once that counter goes ding, the world's most dangerous kitchen timer then sends a signal to pause the right-hand side timer and then tells the coolant system and reactor to chill the heck out. It also activates this left-hand side timer with a bit of a delay, and the fuel rod switching system kicks on. Once left-hand timer reaches its elapsed time, it says to the counter, oh wait, the burritos are done, time to turn it back on, which indicates fuel should have been swapped out. It resets the counter and the whole thing starts microwaving again. To keep redstone timing hijinks and random freak accidents from messing up the stage transfer, I also have a blob of stuff on each of the 2 signal wires that trims the first second or so off the rising edge of the signal and does nothing to the falling edge. This is what generates those little gaps that I made in my pretty picture that explained everything about how this works. Most crucially, any system that needs to turn off the reactor, like, temperature warnings or power throttling, can send a signal on the wire behind me, and that will shut the reactor off but still let everything kind of mostly remember when the fuel rods need to be replaced, but it's fuzzy and kind of doesn't really work, but whatever, it doesn't matter. The one convenient thing about this process is that reactor designs for vac nukes are really stupidly simple. You want as many rods touching as possible, and each rod has to touch at least 1 coolant cell or the thing goes up in smoke. Also, for my specific design, no rods can touch any of the passive cooling vents directly because that will melt the passive cooling vent. There are a couple ways of doing this, but I opt for a 3-column coolant design and then just slam the rest of it full of uranium and heat vents. Normally you would want to be a little bit more careful with this, but I really shouldn't be getting very much heat buildup anyway, so whatever. That probably won't melt, and if they do, it'll just throttle itself. It'll be fine. After some testing to make sure that my cooling threshold is triggered correctly on my warning system, everything looks good, so I disable the force shutdown and let it rip. And just like that, my power problems are solved in spades. This system produces a hair over 1 louv amp, which is an abbreviation short for ludicrous voltage. This is currently more power than I could consume even if I had every single multi-block machine in my base running at once, and I don't think I've ever needed to do that. Even better, there's no startup inefficiency with this design. I flick a lever on, get 16 EV amps as long as I need to charge the battery boxes, and flick it off again. Suffice to say that as long as I keep the fuel rods coming, I'm not going to be running out of juice anytime soon. Now that I have more power than I'm ever going to need for this stage of the game, let's play some actual New Horizons. I have quite a substantial number of quests still backlogged from when I was out in the weeds, and although the questbook rewards seem less and less likely to be actually useful, there is no sense in letting myself fall behind and not get them when I'm just gonna have to do what the questbook wants me to do anyway. With that philosophy in mind, this turns into this. Let's take a look at what I did to get there. The first thing that I did was fixed a couple of crucial issues with the redstone on my nuclear reactor. The first one is that thermal throttling turns off the coolant supply when it gets too hot. It turns off the reactor, so that part worked great, but it also turned off the coolant, so the reactor would be unable to throttle and would get stuck in this weird on-off throttling loop and eventually will stall after melting some of its coolant cells. This is not intentional. The solution here is to separate the logic from the coolant and the reactor so that when the heat throttles, it only turns off the reactor but still lets it cool down. Oops. Thankfully, power fell back on my gas turbines, so I didn't lose power for this. This is why we have redundant design, by the way. I also fixed a separate configuration issue with my item conduits that sort of maybe kind of prevented coolant cells from being extracted from the reactor, which may have contributed to the first set of problems. Oopsies. The third issue that I have to fix with this stupid thing is that I also had a problem where power throttling from my battery box was so aggressive that my fuel cell timer kept getting stalled before it could tick over. This resulted in me using fuel rod durability without telling the redstone system that I was lowering fuel rod durability. This kind of thing is obnoxious to automate. Not going to lie. Once all the nuclear reactor problems got their kinks worked out, I moved on to what I actually wanted to do, which was get a bunch of tungsten steel and HSSG smelting along. HSSG is a precursor to some other alloys and is in and of itself used as a coil upgrade that I'm going to want to have very soon, so it's useful to have, kind of. The tungsten steel is just necessary because I'm going to blow through this stuff like water in a desert, so I just felt like it was wise to stock up. Next is a bunch of pointless quest spaghetti to tell the game that yes, I have in fact made insert X thing here for this tier. This example in particular is the assembler, but this also quickly involves even more quest spaghetti as I try to convince the game that yes, not only have I made this fancy thing, I've also made the 5 precursor things that you need to make it. Thank you for asking. Further quest canoodling convinces the game that I have already made a circuit assembler and a laser engraver as well. And also that I do in fact know how to read a recipe book. And also that I have kind of blasted through all of the circuit quests in like 10 seconds, because I did them already. Presumably at this point, the quest book probably thinks I'm either the world's most cracked New Horizons player or am cheating. One of the two. Continuing in this train, instead of touching grass, I make fancy glass. Fun fact, in newer versions, this stuff is necessary to make the EBF multi that I used to tier skip titanium, since reinforced glass no longer works. Have fun breeding bees to get the borax for this, by the way, because there is no other way of getting borax at that tech level. I also completed this quest because rewriting it is apparently too much effort. Maybe I really shouldn't be bothering with a quest book, it seems to enjoy wasting my time. But whatever, I need this stuff for the next tier anyway, it's fine. And finally, finishing the graphene quest requires a deep dive all the way back to MV to remind the game that yes, I do know in fact how to make extra strong vinegar, and then more redundant fluid crafting. Let's just skip all that and say we didn't. Now that you're all caught up, it's time to play with more nuclear reactors. This time I'm making a breeder. Not that kind of breeder, I'm making a breeder reactor, which is essentially just another giant hotbox that I stick thorium in to decay while bombarding things with neutrons. It does make a little bit of electricity, but the real treasure here is the byproducts you get from all of the decaying thorium, which are used later on for reasons. Unlike my now extremely over-redstoned and incredibly ugly back nuke setup, this thing is passively cooled, and I'm just dumping its power. I just don't really care at this point. Having largely run out of things to do while my EBF processes, I take a few hours to engage in real-person activities, such as eat and sleep, and my system has finally caught up on all the queued material processes. Is what I would like to say. It actually hasn't come anywhere close, but I'm tired of waiting around, so let's get started. And boy, howdy do I mean started. This is gonna take a while, and processing lines in IV are, well, calling them unhinged would probably be a good starting point, but let's put that to the side for now. The first step is a transformer to get power for the few remaining single-block machines I will need, and then crafting a laundry list of random components and a handful of new toys, such as my fancy new IV assembler. My goal was originally to get energy hatches going, but that requires indium, which is waiting on galena, which is waiting on my mining drill to finish up with its old meal so I can pull down a new one. So I'm gonna have to find another something else to do with my time. This project is very quickly thwarted by my near-complete lack of styrene or silicon rubber. Styrene butadiene rubber would require butadiene, which requires an entire branch of oil processing infrastructure that I don't have and don't want, so silicon rubber it is. Thankfully, silicon rubber is pretty easy to make and just requires a bunch of random liquids and gases, some carbon, and some sulfur, so I make a small quantity of that and call my problem solved for the next 5 minutes. This works great for getting my assembler finished. The only problem is that I need like 6 other machines, and all of them seem to require techno-boogers with 30 million mile long processing chains. Take, for example, the IV tier mixer. I can either pay 8 ingots of tungsten steel to make a single fancy glass block, of which I need 4, or just also develop an entire new processing line for processing rare earth metals so that I can feed 2 swicks of yttrium and the left index finger of Thor into a blast furnace and do it that way. What's worse is that the processing line is probably faster and cheaper at this point. Tungsten steel takes a long time to cook. This also brings up another problem that some of you may or may not have noticed, which is that looking at my world brings to mind a three-ring circus with emphasis on the clown show. A lot of this technological gore is leftover ad hoc from when I was getting the ME system set up and had to worry about things like power loss crippling my infrastructure. A lot more of it is just me being a dysfunctional crud monkey who thinks that hostile architecture is the next best thing for society since Justin Bieber stopped being relevant, and can be incorporated into a domestic setting with a similar level of ease of integration. Either way, living in a cesspool of both literal, technical, and artistic debt is not going to fly moving forward, if for no other reason than it makes me want to extract my prefrontal cortex and turn it into goulash. I need a better base of operations, and while If It Fits, It Ships is a great model for the Postal Service, it does not fly quite so well in this mod pack. All that saying is that I want to tear apart my world to the individual block and redesign it from the bottom up. The meteor summoning area and a couple of things that would be way too annoying to move can stay, but everything else is getting reorganized. Since it's all going to be broken and replaced anyway, I also want to take this time to update my mod pack again, since newer versions added a couple sort of kind of important recipes that maybe sort of kind of make this run actually possible to complete. This renovation is going to take a substantial amount of time to pull off, so rather than bore everyone while I place tens of thousands of mostly identical looking blocks of cobblestone for the next week of my life, I'm going to try and do something a little bit different for the next episode, and engage in social interaction. It has not escaped my attention that many of you have questions, recommendations, and requests regarding this series or the channel in general. An associate of mine, whose opinion I highly respect, has finally convinced me that doing an immediate 180 and sprinting in the opposite direction while internally screaming in mortal anguish is not an appropriate response to this, so to fill in all that dead space, I'm going to go through and cherry-pick questions and ideas that I feel warrant a public response. With that in mind, I will be paying particularly close attention to the comments made on this video. Do you have a cool piece of tech that you think might be useful or might have been useful earlier on that you want me to experiment with? Leave it in the comments. Have I made some cripplingly stupid engineering decisions that you think I should fix? Chances are I didn't notice or just straight up did not know any better, and I'm probably going to keep doing it unless you tell me. Are you curious about how I do what I do, why I did something the way I did it, and why I don't do the things I'm not doing? Ask away. I will, however, note that I don't intend to answer personal questions. I'm not bothered by them, but I just don't think that's a particularly great idea. Sorry about that. Additionally, several people have asked questions about memberships and, to a lesser extent, streams. If that is something there is interest in, I have no problem looking into setting those up, but I would be curious to hear if people are interested in those and what they would be looking to get out of them. I will say that I'm not particularly comfortable with the idea of having content that is permanently paywalled or is otherwise inaccessible to everyone. All that said, let's wrap this one up for today. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your time. I hope to hear from you in the comments, and if previous comment history is anything to go off of, I look forward to having all sorts of interesting broken suggestions to do suitability testing on in the next episode. And, as always, I hope you enjoyed.